My dear friend Carter and I were traveling by car to see some of our other college pals. The journey was quite lengthy, roughly 15 hours, but we reasoned that since we were traveling together, we should be able to finish it all at once. After almost 4 hours, Carter took over the wheel from me. I really couldn't sleep while he drove, even if that was the intention. I never managed to settle in, and I'm not sure what it was. I was therefore rather exhausted by the time it was my turn to drive once more, possibly even more so than I had been before to him taking over. Somehow, I never realized the petrol tank was getting so low, but I was still able to keep my eyes open and focus on the road. Carter's old Chevy, which we were using, lacked the sophisticated technology to notify you when your tank is low. I didn't even glance at the petrol gauge that was there. It wasn't until the car began to splutter that I realized we were out of fuel. Carter woke up fast and began looking for the closest petrol station on his phone. But I had to exit the roadway less than 30 seconds later. Thus the vehicle was no longer able to accelerate. I felt very foolish. Even worse, according to Carter, the nearest petrol station was 4 miles away. We found ourselves somewhat in the middle of nowhere. There were no other automobiles on the road, and all we could see were aeroplanes. We spent a few minutes discussing our alternatives, but in the end, Carter made the decision to walk to the closest petrol station and return with a canister, while I remained and observed the vehicle. It might not have been the ideal idea, but having to spend $200 for petrol and calling for assistance when the station was still within walking distance seemed pointless. Even so, it was 1 a.m. Although it was dark outside, but Carter seemed unconcerned as he got out of the vehicle and began to drive. He disappeared within a minute. I just sat back and reflected on how foolish I was to put us in this predicament. However, a few minutes later, I noticed headlights approaching from the road ahead. They descended and went by, but they were moving far more slowly than they ought to have been. They went by at maybe 15 or 20 miles per hour, and I believe the speed limit was 55 or 60. They didn't accelerate after overtaking, as I could see in the side mirror. They continued to slow down, eventually coming to a stop and turning around with a three-pointer. To be honest, I didn't want to acknowledge that I needed assistance or that I was out of gas. I didn't have to, either. They returned to the road and went past at an even slower pace, about 5 miles per hour, this time presumably glancing at me through the windows before accelerating and returning on their original route. What was the purpose of that? For the next several minutes, I watched the road intently to see if they turned around. I had a somewhat unpleasant sentiments regarding it. Perhaps it was simply my intuition, but I began to suspect that something would go horribly wrong very soon. I pulled out my phone and dialed Carter. The phone rang the entire time, but I only wanted to inform him and perhaps to hurry up if at all possible. He didn't answer. I was rather concerned about that, but perhaps he simply had his phone on silent or lost service when traveling. After a minute, I called once more. Nothing has changed. I decided to give up the car and try to catch up with Carter, even though I was clearly not acting logically at this point. If he was still walking, I could jog and catch up in a short while because I believe it had only been 10 or 15 minutes since he had left. Minutes. After making sure the car was locked, I got out and began running along the side of the road. Outside, everything was really silent. It was so silent that I would always hear the ringing in my ears after I stopped jogging since there was not a single sound to block it out. I spent 15 minutes jogging. I believed that by then, I would have caught up to Carter. Unless, for some reason, he started running or jogging. I made the decision to take out my phone and give him another call. And I heard it ringing at that very moment. Somewhere off the side of the road, in the distance, it was very faint. I could just make out a light shining in the grass as I peered out into the emptiness beyond the roadside. My entire body stiffened. Carter. He didn't answer. The only thing I could see was the faint illumination of the phone screen. I called out once more as I stepped off the road and into the grass. I received a response at last. From someplace close to the phone, I could hear Carter's voice, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. Carter yelled again as I rushed closer, and this time I could hear him urging me to get down. Even though I couldn't see him yet, I followed his instructions and ducked under the grass. At that moment, I turned around and noticed a car approaching from behind. I realized right away that it was the identical one I had previously seen traveling slowly. They were trying to find us. Or, I suppose, Carter. They turned back 3 or 4 times, carefully going by the area and clearly looking for us. We woke up and made a reservation at the petrol station as soon as it appeared that they had finally left. According to Carter, the man first stopped and made an attempt to get him into his vehicle. He claimed that he was incredibly eerie and didn't hide the reality of his malign goal. The man got out of his car when Carter refused, and Carter immediately started to run. The guy went back in his car to chase him, perhaps thinking he would just keep running down the road. However, Carter simply hid after running off the road and jumping in the grass. When his phone eventually fell out of his pocket, he was too terrified to stand up and he simply remained hidden rather than come out. In any case, we arrived at the petrol station and received assistance. We also described the man to the police, including his car, but they were never able to locate him. It was a terrifyingly close encounter, and I still feel terrible about being the cause of our predicament. One thing is certain. However, I will always remember to fill up the petrol tank. Music, Story 2, this was recorded in 2014 by Anonymous. Back then, I hardly ever took road vacations because I hardly ever had the opportunity to take several days off just to drive, let alone the extra time to truly enjoy the journey. But when my family was organizing a surprise birthday celebration for my dad's 50th birthday, I was between jobs. In those days, petrol was significantly less expensive than it is today, and flying was much more costly than petrol. I therefore made the decision to drive in order to save money as well as since I was now unemployed. I planned a 3-day road trip just to be safe. I therefore checked into the closest motel and made reservations for the night after my first full day of driving. I didn't mind that it wasn't the most pleasant environment. After sleeping in until 11 o'clock, I packed up and went to go, but I was astonished to see a man standing just in the doorway. Please pardon me. It felt a little weird since I tried to move past him but he didn't really move. The man had large bags under his eyes and appeared to be in his mid-40s. Not the sweetest face overall. He stood eerily outside the motel room, watching me while I packed the rest of the goods into my car. Fortunately, I was leaving that place. I left the motel after checking out and went back to driving. My longest driving day was this one. I was going to put in at least 10 hours. I would say that the first several months went quite well. Much of it passed through towns and cities, and it wasn't until 5 or 6 hours in that they started to fade out and the route turned into long, rural sections. I filled up at the next petrol station after realizing that towns were becoming scarce. After making my payment and turning on the pump, I went inside to grab some coffee. As I was returning to my vehicle, however, I witnessed an automobile approach my own quite closely. From the front, it appeared as though their bumper was in contact with the rear of my vehicle. The vintage Corolla had a deep crimson color. The windscreen was tinted, and no one was outside filling up the petrol tank. Nothing was visible to me through it. However, being aware that someone was, I had the unshakable feeling that they were observing me in there. I exited the petrol station after removing the pump and getting back in. That automobile went almost instantly after, too, without ever filling up the tank or anything, and came up behind me to merge onto the highway. I merely carried on with my driving, assuming that this was all a coincidence. For a while, I could see them 5 or 6 cars behind me, but it was getting dark and I was having trouble telling which cars were which. All I could make out behind me was a collection of headlights. I didn't see that automobile again for another 4 hours or so as the number of cars out decreased as the evening wore on. Since it was never much to start with, I had all but forgotten about it. Now that I had finished my coffee, my main focus was attempting to stay awake. I was determined to reach the closest major city and secure a better hotel, even if it was still 2 hours away. Perhaps even take a morning look about the city. But only if I could keep my eyes open long enough. I reasoned that perhaps if I paused to grab I might be able to get through the next 2 hours with just another cup of coffee, not for the caffeine, but just for the distraction of continuously drinking it. I turned off the highway at the next petrol station. I immediately noticed that the convenience shop area was closed. Despite my disappointment, I decided to pull through because I had to fill up my petrol tank nonetheless. Began to fill it. Almost immediately, I noticed one set of headlights leave the deserted highway and start down the exit ramp in the direction of the petrol station. Being a lone, dark petrol station with nothing surrounding it, this location was already eerie. Not even the lights outside could be seen. Thus, when I identified the vehicle approaching as my heart rate increased immediately upon seeing the deep red Corolla from the other petrol station. I couldn't shake the unsettling suspicion that I was being followed. I quickly unplugged and reinstalled the nozzle, but the car came in so quickly that it didn't even reach the pump before pulling up to the side of my car near the driver's door. I managed to enter just ahead of the passenger door of their vehicle opened. Without hesitation, a man sprang out and rushed to my door, attempting to open it. Looking at him for a moment was enough to identify the man as the one from the motel. I got shivers from those eerie eyes. When he realized he couldn't open the door when I turned on my car, he gave up trying. I looked over at him. I expected to see rage or fury as I withdrew. What I witnessed, however, was even more unsettling. He was beaming broadly, as if this were amusing. Total psychopath. I drove straight back to the highway and continued driving till I got to the city. Fortunately, I'm quite certain I wasn't followed at the time. That dude is what truly frightens me. Exited the vehicle's passenger seat. He was being driven by someone else who was aware of whatever nauseous notion that man was harboring. They followed me out of the motel for more than 10 hours. Worse, they might have been following the previous day without my knowledge. Even after 10 years, that road journey is still difficult for me to forget. Music, Story 3 by Caleb J. I was going home to spend winter break with my family a few years back while I was a college student. There were several long days of non-stop driving because the travel was almost all over the country. However, I wasn't booking any hotels or even motels because I was a broke college student. I thought I would sleep, so I put some blankets in the back seat. Whenever I felt exhausted, anywhere I could. Around 1 a.m. I eventually decided to call it a night after driving for 11 hours straight. I located the next rest area where I could stop and pull over because I was beginning to feel dangerously exhausted. It was one of those tiny pull-offs on the highway's side that are only intended for a few vehicles or vehicles. It featured a little structure with a few vending machines and what appeared to be a lavatory. I parked in the opposite place to give us both some solitude because there was only one other car there, and that was in the spot farthest back. I then stood up to quickly use the loo and stretch my legs. It was somewhat disgusting that the place wasn't clean, but I went to the toilet and then headed back to my car. A man was standing directly outside my window when I did. He was examining my belongings inside. "Can I be of assistance to you?" He was clearly shocked by my voice. He backed up a few feet hesitantly and laughed, claiming he was trying to check whether I was inside to ask whether I could pay for the vending machine with some cash. In a way, my automobile was a fishbowl. There was no need to be pressed up against my windows, peering in like he was, because they were all clear, untinted windows that made it obvious whether or not I was inside. I walked around him to get back in my car and responded, "Yeah, I got no cash on me." "Sorry, man." I was surprised, though, that he stayed. In fact, he made an attempt to strike up another discussion by inquiring as to why I had come out this evening. "I'm traveling by car, I guess." "I apologize, but I need to sleep badly. I am unable to speak at this time." The man waved his apologies before approaching the other car and getting in after I got into mine. The fact that he got into the car and wasn't just a homeless person acting strangely at a random rest stop gave me some relief. However, I believe I was too exhausted to be both uncomfortable and concerned about that man's activities. All I wanted was to go to sleep. In retrospect, however, and in a more composed frame of mind, would have most likely simply left and proceeded to the next rest area. After tidying up the mess in my front seat and throwing everything in the back, I leaned back as far as I could and made an effort to settle in. After only a few minutes of keeping my eyes closed, I noticed some lights moving outside my car and opened them to see what it was. When I looked in the mirror, I noticed that the man had parked his car directly behind mine. For a minute, I observed, wondering why he'd moved at all. However, I felt I had to accept the loss and simply find another place to sleep because things were becoming a bit too eerie. After putting my car in gear and pulling my seat back up, I resumed driving on the highway. While I was pulling away, I muttered a few nasty things about the guy. There weren't many rest stops along this section of road, thus I would have to pay at least 30 to 40 minutes for this inconvenience. I was so exhausted from this travel that it was risky. My eyes would briefly close before opening again when I became aware that I was falling asleep. This essentially continued until I eventually arrived at the next rest break, or what I thought was a rest stop. It was unquestionably abandoned or out of operation, but it looked a lot like the other one. The majority of the buildings outside was covered in graffiti, and it was taped up and in poor condition. It was a place to pull off, though. And I assumed that if I slept here for a few hours, I wouldn't have any problems. I'm not sure if it was the quiet, deserted atmosphere or my extreme exhaustion, but I passed off in less than a minute. I must admit that I slept quite well before I woke up. I believe I went to bed at 2 a.m. until 4 a.m. prior to a huge crash against my automobile waking me up. As I frantically tried to figure out what the hell had occurred, the entire car rocked. I noticed a car's headlights parked exactly in my left mirror. Behind me. I then turned to face the right mirror. A man brandishing a metal baseball bat was standing next to my car. The rear window exploded as he swung it once more. My constant cries of, "What the fuck?" were an attempt to retrieve my keys and escape. The man approached the traveler. I saw it was the man from the other rest stop via the window. With a menacing grin, he began to tease me by calling me a liar repeatedly while he continued to smash the bat at my car. He would then look at me with that smile and continue to call me a liar. Even though I had no idea what he was talking about, I managed to get the car on and drive away before things got worse. With the phone trembling in my palm, I dialed 911. While I was driving off, I managed to meet with an officer at a petrol station, where I was able to describe the situation and document the damage to my vehicle. I had failed to see that my right rear tire was also cut and nearly flat, and there were 2 broken windows and dents all over the doors. All of the glass fragments were on the ground when another officer arrived at the deserted rest area, but the man was already long since gone. Despite alerting every patrol car to the man's appearance and vehicle, they were unable to find anything. I managed to come home safely after spending many days stranded in an unidentified town while my car was being mended. Some folks are so insane that it's absurd. That guy probably lost his since I didn't give him some money for the vending machine or simply because he didn't want to converse. To him at 1 a.m. by the side of the road. The thought that something so ridiculous could have killed me that night is terrible.